Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here, all of you, and thank you for being interested in this part of history and of my story. Yesterday, January 27th, we honored the International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the liberation of Auschwitz. So I translated my mother's journals and researched the history behind her writings. I started it in 2006. I worked on it until 2015. My book was published it was published in 2015. The Polish version of it was published in 2016, and the second edition in English was published November 2020. I will answer all of your questions. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. I will answer all of your questions at the end of my talk. Thank you. Slide 3. Why are we here today? History. I'm meshing history with first-hand accounts. History. Each generation inherits it from the generation before. It tells us how a society will behave. The first-hand accounts are living documents. They tell us about real people and real life. Combining history and the first-hand accounts make a powerful tool, but it will be up to us and the future generations to make sure those living documents stay relevant. Slide 4. Many times in my life, I wanted to separate myself from my mother's history, but I couldn't. My conscience would not allow me to leave her. Elie Wiesel was one of my professors at the Department of Jewish Studies at City College of New York. He made me realize the importance of Holocaust survivor stories. And about 3 weeks before his passing in June of 2016, I was invited to tell my story on the stage at the Promenade Playhouse in Santa Monica, California. This short story is a celebration of memory and Elie Wiesel's influence on me. And I will tell you about, I will actually try to read this story because I used to know it by heart, but that was 2016. It is said that in every survivor's family, one child is unconsciously chosen to be a memorial candle, to carry on the memory and to dedicate his or her life to the memory of the Shoah. I will take you back to where I lived after the war, to the southwestern corner of dreary communist Poland, to our pre-war apartment with a sunny kitchen and a massive wooden table. The table had seen better days. It was wobbly, actually barely standing upright, but it was always covered with a spotless white tablecloth that hung low to the floor. Imagine a small child, fearful of the world around her. To protect myself, I created a sanctuary under that table. Nothing and no one could hurt me there. In our apartment, my mother talked about unthinkable things, about the month-long bombing, her city being on fire, devastation, horror, and death, how she survived and ran east to Russia and Asia. She had read Mein Kampf, what Hitler planned to do to the Jews. This terrified her. After Nazis entered Warsaw, she escaped in November of 1939. She was barely a woman, she was 21. She took with her only a few personal items. Photographs, keepsakes, her entire identity, all that she left behind. After she returned to her beloved city of Warsaw, which was 6 years later, she learned of the details of what Hitler did. Surrounded by a Jewish graveyard, she lost part of her sanity when she discovered that not one member of her family had survived. Running away is what saved her, but pain and helplessness came next. Overwhelmed by the grief and remorse, she lost part of her sanity, and she lived among the ghosts of her family from then on. Photographs are used as a way to remember and connect, but not one photograph existed that connected my mother to her family. She mourned them and brought them back to life daily. She painted pictures of her loved ones, but with words. She used words to describe them. I saw no tangible evidence that mother's family ever existed. I tried to understand how they could just vanish. Adek, Sala, Anja, their husbands, their wives, and children. I was frightened and distraught, but also ashamed. I did not believe my mother. In order for my child's mind to reconcile something I couldn't grasp, I decided my mother was making that family up, that those people never existed. Freud said that in order to mourn, you have to know what you had lost. To protect myself from this anguish, I looked for ways to feel safe. I focused on mother's stories about Russia, which I turned into incredible adventures. I pictured her living in exotic places, the beautiful cities of Saratov and Moscow, where she even fell in love. She lived in Central Asia, in the desert, under hot sun, and ate exotic food. My mother was heroic and strong, blonde, blue-eyed, splendid and beautiful, in her brand new custom-tailored black coat. I would never allow myself to see her hungry, chase after a piece of black bread, be sick with malaria, or get arrested by the NKVD secret police. The Russian stories of where she survived made me want to be like her, to travel to faraway, exotic places, to follow in her footsteps. After all, I was her daughter. I inherited her spirit. We saw the world through the same set of eyes. So I followed with my mother's resolve. I lived under hot sun, slept in a tent, rode a camel, and ate exotic food. I excavated in the desert. I observed the lives of Arab men and women, evoking my mother's stories of mysterious land. But it was during my time in the late 1960s at City College of New York in Professor Elie Wiesel's classes that I connected the dots of how the Holocaust affected my mother and me. I see him clearly, slender and frail, but determined and full of urgency. The horrors he lived through were visible on his face. He was 15 when he and his family were taken to Auschwitz from Romania. He was liberated at Buchenwald. Wiesel's horrors triggered in me my childhood memories of growing up with the ghost of my mother's murdered family. Freud called it shadow memories, acquired traumas, trying to atone what can neither be undone nor ever understood, much less resolved. My childhood in Poland now made sense. I understood that in losing her entire family, my mother could not escape her past. By engraving her stories into my memory, my mother pledged me as the memorial candle, the link between the past and the future. I was the next in line to speak for those whose voices were silenced. When I told Wiesel about my mother, he said, "Your mother must write the story. Future generations must know." It was to a great risk to her sanity and health to re-enter her painful past. But for the sake of the truth, my mother wrote. She bravely brought her family and their life from before the war back to life. And on the day she died, and for the next 7 years, I entered my mother's world and confronted the ghosts of my childhood. Wiesel's advice to me was, don't be afraid of the journey ahead. Professor Wiesel was the catalyst. My mother conveyed strength and perseverance and left me with a living document giving a voice to an entire generation who can't speak for themselves. Next slide, please. I'd like to go over a very brief history of Poland. So Poland converted to Christianity in the 10th century, which is really quite late. By the 14th century, one of the first of Europe's university opened that was in Krakow, and Polish Renaissance followed. Literature, learning, architecture, Copernicus, mathematics, astronomy. Jews started arriving in Poland starting in the 14th century, but they always lived under king's personal protection. Fast forward to the 18th century, Poland was partitioned starting in 1772. Officially, Poland does not exist for the next 123 years. Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire divide up Poland until the end of World War I. But this is what's interesting. What happens? Why Poland doesn't exist? Poland's demise happened from within. The wealthy noblemen sold out Poland to the wealthy neighbors. Why? Why did they do this? They sold out Poland for the promise of more land. Let's acknowledge Polish heroes here. Kazimierz Pułaski, killed at the siege of Savannah, and Tadeusz Kościuszko, he fought the British on the Hudson River. Both fought for Polish independence, and both came to help America in the American Revolutionary War. Slide 6, please. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1918, Poland gains her independence, and the Second Polish Republic is born. Poland, now the map of Poland now is completely different. Poland gets Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarusia. Over 1 million Jews lived here, so now a total of 3.5 million Jews become Polish citizens. Poland, after the First War, is devastated. With the help from America and allies, Poland starts to rebuilding herself. My mother was the last of 6 children. Her father, that would be my grandfather, dies when she's 1 year old in 1918, just as the war ends, of something as simple as an ear infection. He had 2 jobs to support the family. He was a foreman in a small factory that made clothing according to the season, and he had a job in a pharmacy. The oldest boy, Alec, who is 12 at the time, takes over father's job at the factory, and he's paid father's wages, and this is what saves them. The following year, the 2 twin girls turn 12 and they go to work. Now, during this period of history, children as young as 9 or even younger work, and they usually start as apprentice, and meaning that they work without any pay for the first few months. Illiteracy is common, and Bund, which I will tell you about later, fought against child labor. Lack of sanitation contributed to tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery. By some miracle, mother's family was spared. America and allies established soup kitchens to feed the hungry and impoverished Polish people. Every day before going to work, her brother Alek takes my mother, who is just barely a toddler, and she gets a piece of bread and a cup of milk. During World War I, everything was interrupted, including education. My mother's brother, Sevek, homeschools my mother when she's 7. There is no room for them in the public school. Their mother scrapes enough money and sends the brother, who is 3 years older and needs to be educated as soon as possible, to a private Jewish school. This is in my mother's voice from the book, from page 38. I waited in the courtyard of our building for Sevek to come home from school every afternoon, rain or shine. When he arrived, I would grab his books, honored just to carry them upstairs for him. Sevek was an eager student, and he enthusiastically shared at home what he was learning. Mother was elated, and I vowed to be like my brother if given the opportunity. Meanwhile, I copied everything he did for homework. It didn't take long for me to learn the Polish alphabet, and I soon moved on to read from all his Polish school books. I had plenty of time to teach myself while the rest of my siblings were at work and Sevek at school. As the months went by, my pride at learning and to read and write washed away my sorrow. The Jews were a deeply family-oriented people. It is what saved us from tragedy. After the devastation of the Second Temple in 70 CE Common Era, Jews were scattered throughout the world, everywhere a minority without rights, suffering some of the worst persecutions known by the people. Yet they survived because they never lost 3 things: sense of family, community, and their faith. Outside of Eretz Israel, the oldest community is dated to Rome. Jews came here as slaves, the Roman soldiers, or on their own to escape the subjugation. From here, they dispersed, and over the many, many centuries, they became the Ashkenazi Jews or the Sephardi Jews, what we know them today, and by adapting to the culture of Southern or Western Europe. This is in my mother's voice from page 33 about being family-oriented. Coal was expensive, and my mother could not afford to burn it every day. Twice a week, usually on Tuesdays and always on Fridays before the Shabbat began at sundown, Mother managed to burn a little coal in our oven. By Saturday morning, much of the warmth was gone, but since we're all home together, we had another kind of warmth. One Friday night, as we sat around the table in the warm glow of Shabbat candle, Mother looked down at the potato soup and then at us. Poor, but always together, like a mother bird with her newborn chicks in a nest, she said. After dinner, Alek would bring out a book of Jewish songs, and we would all gather around Mother and sing. In our little way, we created a loving and joyous atmosphere for the mother we loved. And just to finish this off, when my mother was 10, her mother, my grandmother, has a stroke, and she was paralyzed for the next 4 years. The siblings plunged into poverty, taking care of her at home. And my grandmother dies 4 years later when my mother's 14. And my mother describes in vivid details taking care of her death and the funeral. After sitting Shiva for 1 week, which is a custom, the siblings go to work and my mother goes to school. A few months later, she graduates from public school. The year is 1931. It is also the saddest day in her life as she has to go to work. She cannot continue her education that she dreams of. Slide 7. I would like to tell you just a little bit about the interwar period that was my mother's Poland. The interwar period refers to the period between World War I and World War II. This was, and this refers to the Jewish part of Poland, I guess. It was, you had Orthodox Jews, that was very simple. They observed strict religious practices. But you also had the ideology of Zionism and Buddhism. Those ideologies blossomed across Europe, Russia, and Poland at the end of 19th and early 20th century. This was a response to the state-sponsored anti-Semitic violence and discrimination. However, each ideology took a different path, and this is really interesting. Zionism wanted to return to their ancestral home, which was Palestine. They believed that to preserve their Jewish identity, heritage, and self-emancipation, they needed to be in their own country. And as many as 5% of Polish Jews, now I'm talking just Polish Jews, did go to Palestine. However, most Polish Jews were Bundists. Those were Poles of Jewish religion. My mother was a Bundist. Now, what did they believe in? Bundists believed that they could preserve their Jewish heritage, identity, and coexist with non-Jews anywhere in Europe. What did they fight for? They fought for workers' rights mostly, and to end child labor. Bund was legal because they did not want to overthrow the government. They believed their world was different from that of their parents. In the end, Bund proved to be a failed ideology. They mistakenly believed they were safe in Europe. Communists, let's just mention them very quickly. They were illegal. They always were being arrested because they did want to overthrow the government. And for the most part, they were leaving, crossing the border actually illegally. The borders were closed because they wanted to be in Russia. They wanted to be part of the revolution. The Great Depression of the 1930s affected Poland, an agricultural country, not an industrial country, longer and more severely. And in 1935, the great leader, Józef Pilsudski, dies. Pilsudski stood for equal rights for all Polish citizens. And my mother writes how the entire Warsaw cried upon his death. And this is when tension rose between Polish Jewish citizens and Polish citizens. Roman Moski's party and Decja were a fierce opponent to Pilsudski's principles and blamed Poland's economic problems on Jewish citizens. Now they became even more radical, moving their ideology closer to fascism. And one of the things that happened to my mother's family personally, her brother Sevek is violently attacked in one of the public parks in Saski Garden. Slide 7. Slide 8, please. Let's leave Poland alone for a little bit and let's talk about Hitler because it's really important how those started. Austria-Hungary and Germany. They lose the war they started. What's the punishment? The punishment is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled and Germany was disarmed. In 1923, Hitler, a disgruntled soldier of World War I, plots treason against the government. He is arrested, but he spends less than 1 year out of the 5-year sentence for high treason in prison. And in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf. Hitler was not democratically elected. He was appointed to Chancellor in 1933. And it's amazing how many people don't know that. He was appointed by the top German politicians who believed they could keep Hitler in control. What happens a year later, the night of the long knives, Hitler ordered his elite SS guard to murder anyone who opposed him. There's about 1,000 that were killed, another 1,000 thrown in prison. Hitler becomes a dictator. Already in 1933, Hitler was arming Germany. This was illegal per Treaty of Versailles. And the European leaders turned a blind eye to this. Pacifists ended up helping Hitler the most. Neville Chamberlain thought the best policy was to appease the aggressor Hitler. Peace for our time gave Sudetenland, or part of Czechoslovakia, to Hitler in 1938. The aggressor Hitler becomes emboldened, and he attacks Poland on September 1st, 1939. Start of World War II. In 1933, 0.75%, that's less than 1% of Jews lived in Germany. Yet Hitler got his countrymen into a frenzy and blamed Jews for all of Germany's ills. Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, controlled the media and the technology available to them at the time for 10 years before mass murdering of Jews started. Books by Jewish writers were destroyed by students and at universities. In a national book burning, the anti-Semitic and racist Nuremberg laws of 1935 crippled Jews economically and socially. So what does that mean? It stripped them of citizenship, civil rights, possessions, and in the end, it removed them from German society altogether. But first, Hitler targeted the people who were physically and mentally disabled. They did not measure up to Hitler's idea of the master race. The euthanasia program had the cooperation of nurses, doctors, and office workers. The German public protested, and the program continued on a smaller scale and in secrecy, and became the model for the extermination of Jews, but this time there was no protest. Kristallnacht. You can see in 48 hours what happened. I can see. There was something like 1,000 synagogues destroyed, 7,500 business vandalized, and 90 people were killed, and 30,000 men arrested and sent to concentration camps. Now, all this information of what's going on in Germany was reaching my mother in Poland. So what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf were becoming reality. September 1st, Hitler, of 1939, Hitler attack on Poland. The first person in my mother's family who suffered was Sala. A bomb fell on her building. She managed to escape with her 2 little boys, and